There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man when the noise of fame finally fades. No more cameras, no more crowds chanting a catchphrase that once echoed across continents. Just the sound of waves, the weight of memory, and the long reckoning of a life lived loudly but not always wisely. At 85 years old, Paul Hogan has arrived at that silence, and for the first time in decades, he is filling it with the truth about the marriage everyone celebrated, the woman he never truly understood, and the years he spent confusing provision with love. The confession didn't come in a single dramatic moment. It came in fragments, candid admissions during rare interviews, unguarded comments to old friends, and the kind of quiet honesty that only visits a man when he no longer has anything left to protect. What Paul Hogan has finally said in his own weathered words, "Is this the marriage to Linda Kozlowski?" was not the fairy tale the world believed it to be. It was, in many ways, a slow and painful education in everything he had never learned about love. To understand the marriage, you first have to understand the man. Paul Hogan was not born into glamour. He grew up in working-class Sydney, left school early, and spent years doing manual labor on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, one of the most iconic structures in the world, though it offered him little romance at the time. What he had, even then, was an instinct for making people laugh, a sharpness, a way of deflecting difficulty with a grin and a quip. That instinct would eventually make him one of Australia's most beloved entertainers, and then, improbably, a global movie star. By the mid-1980s, Hogan was already in his mid-40s, older than most men who attempt to reinvent themselves on the world stage. But he backed himself. He co-wrote and starred in Crocodile Dundee, a film that took a modest idea about an outback bushman loose in New York City and turned it into a worldwide phenomenon. The film grossed over $300 million. It made Paul Hogan a household name in countries that had never heard of him before, and it introduced him to a young actress from Connecticut who would change the entire course of his life. Linda Kozlowski was 27 when she was cast as Sue Charlton, the sharp American journalist who falls for Mick Dundee's rough-edged charm. She had trained rigorously at Juilliard and paid her theatrical dues on Broadway. Crocodile Dundee was her first major film role, and she approached it with the discipline of someone who had worked hard to earn their place. What neither she nor Paul anticipated was how seamlessly the fiction between their characters would begin to mirror something real. The chemistry that audiences would later celebrate on screen was not manufactured. People who were present on set during filming consistently described the atmosphere between them as charged, not performative, but genuine. The jokes lingered past the director's cut. The conversation stretched long after the crew had wrapped for the day. The complication, of course, was that Paul was still married. He and his first wife, Nolene, had been together since 1958. They had 5 children, and a history that stretched back to a time when Paul was still an unknown laborer. Their marriage had already been tested. The pair had briefly separated in the early 1980s, but by the time Crocodile Dundee went into production, they were still formally together. The separation from Nolene that followed was not abrupt, but it was irreversible. Paul filed for divorce in 1986. He has never spoken about that chapter with much detail, but those who knew him then say the decision, whatever its complications, came from a place of genuine feeling. He was, by all accounts, deeply drawn to Linda, and she to him. They married in 1990. Paul was 51, Linda was 32. The world applauded. What the world couldn't see was the fundamental difference in how these two people understood what a life together was supposed to look like. Paul Hogan was, at his core, a traditionalist. His idea of devotion was tangible and practical: build something lasting, provide generously, show up every day. He bought Linda a custom-built home, a physical declaration of his commitment. He invited her into his professional world, casting her alongside him in sequels and other projects. In his mind, loyalty was expressed through action, through the structuring of an entire life around another person. Linda had a different understanding. She had spent years building an identity as a performer, cultivating a voice that was distinctly her own. The role in Crocodile Dundee had been the beginning of something she hoped would grow. Instead, the roles that came to her afterward were diminishing variations on the same type, the capable but secondary woman beside the charismatic male lead. She found the work unsatisfying, the scripts lazy, and the industry's perception of her frustratingly narrow. By the time their son Chance was born in 1988, and as the years of the 1990s unfolded, Linda's professional ambitions had largely been absorbed by domestic life. She was raising a child. She was managing a household built around Paul's career and Paul's image, and though she did it without obvious complaint for many years, something in her was quietly suffocating. Paul, meanwhile, genuinely believed he was doing everything right. This is perhaps the most painful part of the story, not that either of them was cruel, but that they were simply operating from entirely different emotional languages. He saw the house, the security, the faithfulness. She felt the silence, the invisibility, the slow erosion of her own story. Neither was wrong exactly, but neither was right enough to save what they had built. By the early 2000s, even the professional connection had thinned. Crocodile Dundee in Los Angeles, released in 2001, became Linda's final film credit. It was not a triumphant send-off, but something closer to a quiet exit. She spoke later about the experience with exhaustion, about roles that offered her nothing meaningful, about the physical toll of working in an environment that treated her as an afterthought. After that, she largely withdrew from the industry altogether. And as she stepped back from acting, she also began to step back from the marriage, not in one dramatic gesture, but in the incremental way that people disengage when they have finally decided that a door leads nowhere. In October 2013, Linda filed for divorce in Los Angeles. The cited reason was irreconcilable differences, the legal language for a fracture too deep to name in court documents. At the time, Paul was 74. Linda was 56. Chance was a teenager, old enough to feel the weight of what was happening, but not yet equipped to fully carry it. The divorce was finalized in July 2014. Paul kept the rights to the Crocodile Dundee character and the production company. Linda received a single payment of $6.25 million, the right to remain in the family home for up to 4 years, and shared custody of their son. There was no ongoing financial arrangement. The bond was cleanly, deliberately severed. When Linda spoke publicly about the end, she said something that stayed with those who heard it. She described having lived for many years in Paul's shadow, and said that it felt good, finally, to sense her own light again. It was not a bitter statement. It was a statement of relief. Paul's response, characteristically, was more restrained. He said the marriage had simply run its course. He acknowledged the distance that had grown between them, but it was only years later, when the defenses were lower and the loneliness had settled in more fully, that he began to speak with real candor. The admissions came slowly and across different occasions. In one interview, he acknowledged that he had always thought he was doing the right thing, providing, committing, staying present in the ways he understood presence. But he admitted that wasn't enough to make someone feel seen. In another conversation, he described the end of the marriage as something he carried with him, not as anger, but as a kind of hollow awareness of what had been lost. "I loved her deeply," he said, "but sometimes love isn't enough. It is a simple sentence, the kind that gets repeated so often it risks losing its meaning." But from Paul Hogan at 85, after everything, the tax investigations that dragged on for years and nearly destroyed his reputation, the physical decline that has gradually unmade the rugged image he once embodied, the quiet years alone in Venice Beach, those words carry a specific gravity. They are not a performance. They are a reckoning. What Paul has come to understand, it seems, is that emotional availability is not something you can substitute with material comfort, that a person can be present in every structural sense there, faithful, providing, and still leave the person they love profoundly alone. It is a lesson that came too late to save his marriage, but it is at least a lesson finally learned. Linda Kozlowski rebuilt. She moved between Los Angeles and Morocco, entered a new relationship with a businessman named Moulay Hafid Baha, and launched a luxury travel company called Dream My Destiny in Marrakesh. She invested in property along Venice Beach, turning her settlement into a portfolio. She found in her 50s and beyond the independence that her marriage had quietly taken from her. Paul stayed. He remained in Los Angeles, in the city where the marriage had lived and died. His health has become a visible concern: muscle deterioration, chronic pain, the physical diminishment that age brings. His public appearances are infrequent and carry a fragility that contrasts sharply with the vigorous image of Mick Dundee that still plays on television screens around the world. In 2025, the two came together once more for a retrospective project surrounding the original Crocodile Dundee film, a remastered release, and an accompanying documentary. Standing beside Linda again, Paul was visibly moved. Their son Chance, now in his mid-20s, was part of that moment too. It was not a reconciliation. It was something more honest than that: two people acknowledging the story they had shared, without pretending it had ended the way either of them would have chosen. There is no neat conclusion to the story of Paul Hogan and Linda Kozlowski. It does not resolve into redemption or reconciliation. What it resolves into is truth, the kind that takes decades to surface, that only becomes possible once the pride and the performance have worn away. Paul Hogan made the world laugh for the better part of 50 years. He built a character so enduring that it still defines how many people picture Australia. He achieved things that no one from his background was supposed to achieve, and yet, by his own admission, sitting now with the accumulated weight of his 85 years, the thing he reflects on most is not the fame or the money or the cultural footprint he left behind. It is the woman he could not hold on to, the marriage he could not save, the love that, in the end, was real, but not enough. That is perhaps the most human thing about him, not Mick Dundee, not the tax scandals or the Hollywood sequels, just a man, old now and honest at last, who finally said out loud what he had been carrying quietly for years.